Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We're so glad that you're here with us today. My name is Ann Stinky. I am Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the College of Business here at Oregon State University. And on behalf of the College of Business and the Division of Academic Affairs, I am thrilled and honored to introduce today's guest. So when we first started planning today's workshop, I expected maybe 50 or 60 people to sign up. I clearly underestimated that number. Instead, we had several hundred people sign up to attend today. And it's no wonder. The topic of neurodiversity is relevant and deeply personal for so many of us. And so we are privileged today to have Ludmila Praslova as our neuro-inclusion collaborator and guide. Ludmila Praslova, PhD, SHRM, SCP, is the author of The Canary Code, a guide to neurodiversity, dignity, and intersectional belonging at work, which was listed as one of the top new management books for 2024 by Thinkers50. She is a professor of graduate industrial organizational psychology at Vanguard University of Southern California, with over 25 years of experience in developing talent-rich organizations. Dr. Praslova regularly writes for Fast Company, Harvard Business Review, and Psychology Today, and she is the first person to have published in Harvard Business Review from an autistic perspective. Just so you know, we will be recording today's workshop for those who can't attend, and you can use the chat button to respond to reflection prompts, as well as the Q&A button to pose questions to Dr. Praslova, depending on how much time we have at the end of the workshop. But let's get started. Please welcome Dr. Ludmila Praslova.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and I'm grateful that all of you decided to join this webinar today. Hopefully we'll have a good conversation, and I'm happy to answer some questions as well. Obviously, it's a huge topic, so let's jump into it. I tried to integrate answers to some of the questions that you previously submitted when you signed up, but if you have any other questions, if you want to dig into any of the topics, I will be thrilled to spend as much time having this conversation as possible. So let me just share my slides. And I was able to do it earlier, so it should be, okay, there we go. And let's just spend some time talking about what neurodiversity is, what you already know, and what we could continue exploring so that we could create better environment for our students, but then really better educational environment for everyone, so that we have a society where people of all the different brain wirings can thrive. And again, there's been this fantastic information about me. I don't need to go into any of that. I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn if you wanted to connect. So if you just type my name, it's going to bring up my LinkedIn profile very easily. And you can also find a lot of additional information there. Now, let's just think about neurodiversity. I know we all have different ideas, but what it is, just type in the first thing that comes to your mind. There's no right and wrong answers. Just tell us, give us some examples for what do you think neurodiversity is. And I actually can't see your answers, so I'm going to have to ask someone to read your answers and just give me some samples of, okay, so it looks like there are, chat is disabled, people are saying that chat is disabled. Okay, well, sometimes those things just happen. Can you see my presentation? Can I just keep?
Yeah, it looks like chat is disabled for some reason.
Okay.
We're working on trying to fix that. Sorry about that.
Okay. Well, I've asked these questions to people before, and typically people say things like, okay, it looks like something might be happening now in Q&A. Okay, processing information differently, different ways of relating to other people. Okay, neurodiversity to me looks like my family. I love it. Misunderstanding jokes, instructions, faces, not being brilliant, but being brilliant in other ways. Okay, so those are pretty sophisticated ways to think about it, because we will talk about spiky profiles and how you can be very gifted in some ways and not so great in other ways. So challenges and executive function. Okay, opportunity to improve things for everyone. Autism, ADHD, depression, different mental health. Yes, so the different types of divergent thinking. Yes, so different perspectives of learning and teaching. All of those are really great examples of what comes to our minds when we think about neurodiversity. And along with all of those great things that you just named, we also sometimes experience a variety of myths. So, for example, there are quite a few people who believe that neurodivergence is something new, that it's caused by modern living, and it's not something that existed in other centuries, which of course it did. We just use different names for it in other centuries, sometimes nice words, sometimes not so nice words. And another idea is that neurodivergence can be cured, fixed, or prevented. And that is another problem because neurodivergence is a function of humanity, and we need people with all the different abilities. We need people who are very quick to pay attention to danger and address it, and people who are always scanning the environment. We also need people who focus on something in depth and make sure that every detail is correct. So there is this range that humanity collectively needs, but then in individuals, it is sometimes labeled as a deficit or a problem and something that people try to fix and cure, forgetting that society of clones is not going to be successful, that we need all those different abilities. And yes, when we use words like, depression or words like autism, ADHD, people might start thinking about disorders, but the whole idea of neurodiversity paradigm is to think about neurodivergence as differences, in some ways, even cultural differences. There's autism culture, there's neurodivergence culture, and not necessarily thinking about it in those medical terms, let's cure you and let's fix you. And sometimes people say, well, you don't look autistic. That's another classic. People think there's a look to either autism or ADHD. And there are so many different ways that we can be neurodivergent that there is absolutely no uniform look. And we are all very different in how we think and how we present, and obviously in how we process on the individual level. So all those myths, unfortunately, are very popular, but can be pretty harmful sometimes when we're trying to think about neurodivergence as something that is a form of diversity and that society may want to consider accommodating it better rather than trying to get rid of it. So neurodiversity terminology is also sometimes very tricky because sometimes people just kind of put all kinds of meanings into it that were never intended. And the intended meaning is really just a full range of diversity in human neurodevelopment. It doesn't mean a particular psychological difference that's labeled within diagnostic manual. It could be completely outside of it. Then, for example, many people consider giftedness a form of neurodivergence as well, as long as it's just something that's not exactly within what people consider the average. And we all know that really this kind of average, normal, they're very arbitrary. Sometimes people put statistics to it and they say, well, you have to be normal, which kind of means, like everybody else. But if you think about it culturally, what is normative, what's expected human behavior in modern US versus in medieval Europe, versus in Japan, versus, let's say, in medieval Middle Eastern societies, there are cultural elements to what is expected and to what is considered normal, which is why it's more of a cultural standard than something that is, necessarily found in the brain. In some cases, yes, there are brain differences that we can find, but in many cases, it's very much a societal expectation in which we're supposed to fit. And people who can relatively painlessly fit into that idea of normative, we call neurotypical. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that we can scan your brain and say that you're neurotypical, but you generally enjoy the things that society tells you you need to do. Not the case with neurodivergent people. Sometimes we don't look neurodivergent because we, let's say, can force ourselves to do those things that society wants us to do, like go to places with loud music because that's supposed to be enjoyable, but you're actually not enjoying it, and you might actually get sick if you keep doing this or stay for any period of time. So you're trying to fit into that idea of neuronormativity and try to do things that society wants from you, maybe small talk, maybe sitting still if you have ADHD, and you can't sometimes force yourself to do it, but eventually it drains you, it burns you out, it can make you sick in the extreme if you're trying to mask too hard. And then there are people who really can't perform neuronormativity, and those are more likely to get labeled and given a diagnosis, but it's definitely not something that's visible, and many people are just at the very high cost at themselves, are presenting as neurotypical for a variety of reasons, very often because they are consciously aware of biases, and it's also possible that they are just unconsciously trying to fit in and doing what's expected, and then they just can't figure out why are they always so exhausted. Sometimes it takes decades for someone to figure out that they've been trying so hard and just don't seem to make it in this average society. Well, that's because they're not average. And again, neurodivergent can be anything. It could be autistic or dyslexic, but it could be things that we don't talk about very much. So like long COVID with the differences in attention and memory and ability to focus is also a form of neurodivergence, acquired neurodivergence. And the same thing with brain trauma. And it also could be positive things. Again, the extremes of intelligence are considered neurodivergence, regardless in which direction. And we are also using another term, neurominority, because neurodivergent is such a broad term that sometimes we want something more specific to refer to people who were born different and it's inseparable from who they are, and they also experience specific extent of prejudice or disadvantage because of it. So in some cases we want to use this more specific term, neurominority, if we want to talk about people like autistic people, dyslexic, Tourette's is usually included within neurominorities. And sometimes people use the term neurodiverse to refer to individuals, but mostly experts on neurodiversity prefer to reserve this term for collectives. So your team, your work group, your student body is neurodiverse, but individuals are neurodivergent or members of neurominority group. And again, happy to talk about it more. Is just something that sometimes becomes a contention point. Now, the more interesting and applied point is that there are specific characteristics that very often found in all the different neurodivergent groups, and that is that we're all extremely different. And we're different in a kind of predictable way, in that we have spiky profiles. So specific abilities, specific differences are, as different as individual humans. But the spikiness is very typical of neurodivergent profiles. So if you can look at the red one, let's say it's your typical B plus student. They can do most things reasonably well. And usually that is someone we think of as neurotypical. But then you also have a student who is, let's say, really, really good, A plus through the roof. Just give them a degree in 2 years, in some areas, and struggling, D minus in other areas. So that is what we're thinking about when we're thinking about spiky profiles. There are obviously differences in abilities within what we call typical, but they're reasonable, but they're relatively subtle. B plus, B minus kind of difference, B plus, A minus. Here we're with neurodivergent people, we're dealing with much more significant spikiness and much more significant valleys and peaks of abilities. And if we were thinking about it, sometimes people say, well, you're failing. You are not going to amount to anything. And what we're really saying, they're failing at being average. If we were paying attention to those areas of brilliance, areas where they perform well, and focus on those strengths, we can have people who are really bringing something unique not only to our classroom conversations, but to society and to the workplace if we're able to capitalize on those strengths and not tear people down so much because of those lows of their abilities that they're just so too traumatized to even try anything. So that is one thing that we need to think about when we're working with neurodivergent students. How much we're focusing on remedying deficits, which is a deficit approach, and very often that's where we kind of end up being stuck, versus how much time and effort do we want to put into helping them develop their strength, because that is something that might be able to build up a unique career path and really ability to contribute to society in ways that benefit the individual and everyone. So trying to remember the spiky profiles is really relevant whenever we're considering any kind of difference in how we work with neurodivergent people. And unfortunately, society has not done a great job at working with neurodivergent people. And very often, we are talking about those awful statistics for all neurodivergent people. About 30 to 40% unemployment rates in the States for autistic college graduates. Really awful statistics. Again, there are sometimes hard to check, but for the most part, we do know that 85% unemployment and underemployment is probably pretty good estimate for the US. UK slightly better. They're proud of their 78% versus US 80%, but there are some countries that do a little bit better. So Germany, Australia are around like 40 to 30%. So they do better. They're not ideal, but they do better. And there are still gaps. So, for example, in Germany, autistic people are more educated than the general population, but they're still underemployed at very significant rates, even though it's not as drastic, but they're still significant underemployment numbers. And there's also issue with educational settings. And that is a paradox, because we do know that when neurodivergent people are matched to what they do, they perform exceedingly well. And we try not to stress the statistics from, Morgan Chase autism employment, but they do report that autistic people perform 140 up to 140% better than the typical employee. So think about that. People who perform that much better have that huge unemployment rate. Obviously, there's a very significant disconnect between abilities and how society welcomes and treats those people. And very often those issues that we see in the workplace also exist in education. And even though many neurodivergent people are able to get degrees and do well, doesn't mean they don't struggle. Even in countries that are considered to be some of the most advanced in welcoming neurodivergence. So this data is from Australia, but even Australian students report feeling unwelcomed on the university campus, stereotyped, and being told that you don't fit the stereotype and you don't look autistic, and also environments that are just physically not welcoming. So a lighting that's very harsh, smells, sounds, uh, just very overwhelming physical environments that make neurodivergent people feel like they don't belong in, on college campus and many other uh, places in society. And basically, that makes you feel like you don't belong. And that is across all the different studies, one theme that we hear from neurodivergent people. The world is not designed for me, and I feel like I don't belong. So if we're thinking about belonging, it comes from many different sources. So we'll talk about it in a second, but society just doesn't seem to understand neurodivergent people, in part because of our spiky profile. So we're told, let's say in college, that's another part of that Australian report, we're told that you won't be a good teacher based on, the diagnosis very often and the label, or you can be paramedic. That's actually the someone that I know, someone was just told, no, you can't be what you want to be because of your particular neurodivergent label. But this person wanted to persist and they just wanted to do what they wanted to do and they did it. But very often there's just idea that if you have any kind of neurodivergent label, then you're there are many things that are just impossible for you, which is obviously not true. But on the other hand, if you don't present in a stereotypical way, then people say, no, you're doing fine. You're doing fine in, let's say, reading and writing. Therefore, you're faking your issues with, let's say, social communication, or you're faking your issues with math, or you're so successful that it cannot be that you are unable to do other things that you want you to do. Again, that happens from early childhood through older age for neurodivergent people. People just don't understand spiky profiles and they say you should be either good at everything or you're not capable of anything. And that is a lifelong struggle with both denial of ability and denial of difficulty for many neurodivergent people. And that obviously does not help with belonging. But there are many aspects of belonging that I talk about in my book that uh, let's say we very often talk about social inclusion and supporting people in participating in the community. But if we're only saying, okay, we're going to invite you to the party, but the party, whatever it is, whether it's learning environment or the actual party, is not welcoming to who you are, it's not enough. So it's not just enough to be invited to the party. The party actually needs to be set up in a way that you are not physically overwhelmed, that you're not emotionally overwhelmed, and that you're welcomed as you are without trying to um, fake something and try to present yourself as a different person. So we need more flexible cultural and social norms before we can have social inclusion. And we also need things like cognitive inclusion, where people are not ridiculed for, not having linear thinking, or communicating in different ways, or having a different productivity pattern, where people can accomplish wonderful things, but their schedule needs to be different. And some people can work in 40-minute standard units of time. Other people need 20 minutes break, 20 minutes break, and other people need 3 or 4 hours to focus. Our society is not built for that. Our education is not built for that uh, difference in productivity that we're wired for. And that's before we get to emotion. People are told to there's just one way to be, and if you don't fit into it, you get called all kinds of names just because you sometimes people say you're too happy, sometimes people say, why are you crying? And when this kind of the lack of emotional inclusion is something that is a part of a cultural environment, it's very hard for us to function. And if we are in a physically hostile environment, how are we supposed to belong if we're blasted with loud music that makes us want to faint? And that's really physically hurting us, with lighting that's physically hurting us. So the lack of sensory inclusion is one of the things that people don't talk about enough. But many neurodivergent people literally are limited in what we can do and how we can show up in the society, because physical environments are not designed for sensory accessibility. And I'm going to talk about specifically how all of those translate for higher education. So how can we support student belonging in all of those different ways? And how do we account for all of our many differences? So if any of you are in student support or in student development, we want students to socialize. But sometimes we, want to see how many people scanned their IDs, and my university does that. We want to see so many people were at this activity, and the more the better. And sometimes people need a small event to be comfortable. So there's nothing wrong with small events, small clubs, online communities, because people engage socially in different ways. And for some people, it's an interaction in a very small group, and a large event is going to be off-putting and very often sensory overwhelming. So consider diverse social options. Ask students what they need, and actually, you know, staff and faculty, what they need. How do we have events that are inclusive and not making people feel like they don't belong on campus? And provide flexibility in participation. Allow people to engage in person, online, in a variety of ways, so that there's not just one way to socialize. And if you don't fit into this super extroverted, boundless social energy uh, stereotype, then it's pretty hard to function. And obviously, in education, we want to think about cognitive inclusion, which really means helping people discover who they are and build on their strength. And we're talking about specific strength assessments, objective cognitive assessments. Interests also matter, but we really want to build it on not just, self-assessment, which is good, but sometimes we really want those formal instruments so that we can really help people um, figure out what is the best path for them that aligns with their abilities. And sometimes it's also obviously self-discovery and so forth. Strength-based learning opportunities. College usually is better than, middle school and high school as far as ability to align your path. And I think we're trying to develop curriculum that is increasingly strength-based, but sometimes we really could think about it very carefully and see how can we provide enough options where people do get variety and develop different skills, but they don't, not graduate because there's this one class that they just cannot do, even if they're wonderful in other areas. And diverse teaching methods. We do not want to, destroy faculty and tell them they need to teach to everyone, because that definitely is very difficult. I know some of you asked that question, but providing a menu of options and having group presentations, papers, tests, a little bit of everything. And sometimes I allow people to just drop one. So rather than trying to, do everything for everyone, give people enough ways to show their learning in flexible ways. But then if there's just one thing that completely doesn't work with their brain, just in my own teaching, sometimes I just let people drop one. And if we have time, I'm happy to talk more about how to vary instructional strategies without making faculty do something that's really impossible for their own brains. And I also give you a little article for how to support neurodivergent educators. But it's definitely important that we don't rely on just tests or just papers or just presentations. And we need to have opportunities for students to learn in a variety of different ways and show their learning in different ways. And many universities are playing with tailored academic pathways and, trying to help people find careers where they're going to be more successful. It's something that we just need to keep playing with and balancing the ability to give people as much of diverse education and varied education as possible, but also really help them to focus on something that is their area of interest and area of passion. And then accessible communication is also very important. I'm a reader and I'm very tempted to just, write to people and everyone should read, but not everyone is a reader. And yes, some people need audio, some people need video. It's increasingly easy to just use technology to translate from our preferred method of communication to someone else's preferred method of communication. So we are able to do that more and more without really doing something that taxes us excessively. So accessible communication is becoming easier and easier with technology. But again, we can provide different learning paths. We can encourage people to, be all you can be. But if we don't have genuine emotional inclusion, we are not helping people. And very often we're just very judgmental as a society. We have those neuronormative ideas about sadness and how happy you're supposed to be. Those things are also gendered. And very often we're also telling you that, grow up and learn how to, behave yourself. And sometimes it's really not very neuroaffirming. And we're telling people, just cognitively, just stop thinking those things. What works for many neurodivergent people is actually starting with physical. Because again, if our bodies are in distress, our emotion is going to be in distress, and then our cognition and our social environment, because just our physiological processing is much faster than anything else. And that's why some regulation can also come from things like, just, holding hands and playing with fidget toys and doing, just standing on the ground, that whatever works for people sometimes is much more effective than going from cognitive to emotion, because cognitive processing is just plain slower than emotional processing. If you start with physical and sensory, which is quite a bit faster than emotional processing and way faster than cognitive processing, we're more likely to have good results. and never make it about other people's comfort. Like you are disturbing other people, and therefore you need to change your emotion. That's a demand. That's not giving people choice. We're not trying to force someone to fit in and squish who they are and their genuine emotion. I want people to handle their emotions better because it's their choice, and this is what they want to do for their own well-being. But very often it's also presented like, no, you do it for my well-being because you are upsetting me by crying. And that is not what I'm talking about. So we need to teach the entire community about both methods and purposes of emotional regulations that are neuro-inclusive. And I already mentioned physical environment a number of times. It's very difficult to function, let's say, for someone who has sensory sensitivities. In my case, it's auditory sensitivities. I hear everything. And if people are blaring music, studying is not going to happen. Nothing is going to happen. And you can't wear earplugs and earmuffs 24/7. I know, I tried. It's just, it does bad things to your ears. And creating sensory-friendly environments, calmer environments is really something that works for everyone. Because what happens if you have, let's say, an airport sensory room, everybody wants to use it, not just neurodivergent people. So if you create sensory-friendly environments, it actually is pleasant for many people. And it's very easy to add stimulation, like put on headphones and listen to extra music. But it's very hard to remove unnecessary stimulation in the environment. So making environments calming and then adding stimulation as needed is usually a little bit easier than creating a very loud environment and then saying, okay, how can we help some people survive within it? But again, it's not just sound, it's smell, it's lighting, it's everything. There's a whole science of how to create physical environment more comfortable for those people who have more sensitive nervous system and more sensitive sensory processing. And now, who do you think else could benefit from social, cognitive, emotional, um, and sensory inclusion? So just give me a few ideas for who else do you think will benefit from this? Let's see, I'm going to Q&A. Okay. Let's see, everyone, exactly. Uh, everyone benefits from being included. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear, because that is really the whole point. That's why my book is called The Canary Code. When you make environments that support those who are more sensitive, more vulnerable, everyone benefits, because it's not just canaries who were the actual canaries in actual coal mines, who were actually used to detect toxic gases, and then they were given oxygen to revive them. So we still have those little contraptions in museums where canaries were given oxygen. And it's not because canary is broken. Sensitivity is not brokenness. It's by design. It allows them to fly and sing and do the bird things. But if we do not pay attention to canaries and we just say, they have a problem, so we just need stronger canaries, then eventually we are going to create environment that's so toxic that everyone is going to feel it. So if we detoxify our environments to the point where those who are most sensitive are well, that is going to be healthy environment for everyone. And that's obviously applicable everywhere. Classroom, workplace, and my book deals with the workplace. And if we create workplaces that are neuro-inclusive and supportive, it's definitely something that benefits everyone. If we have valid decision making, if we focus on outcomes, if we're flexible, everyone benefits from those workplaces. Now, I know that many of our workplaces are not there. This is the ideal. This is the workplaces where we want to see just humanity and neuro inclusion throughout the entire employment cycle. Now, we're not living in that ideal world. So what do we do when we're trying to help students with their careers? That's another big question, kind of the last big question I wanted to address here today. How do we help students with their career development in a neuroaffirming way in the world that is very often not neuroaffirming? Should we just tell students mask harder and the world is cruel, so you just should never disclose? In some cases, that's kind of the truth, that the world is not good, but we probably want to be a little bit more nuanced, and we want to say, how can you create your path in a world where, yes, there are toxic organizations and problematic environments? Now, we do know that employment of autistic people is not helped by changing autistic people. So Scott et al. Looked at about 15 different studies, and there is evidence that individual interventions improve work skills. However, it did not improve employment, because it's not just what neurodivergent people do, it's how environment treats them. So really trying to fix autistic people so they fit better in the workplace, that's still going to reject them because there's so much bias, doesn't work. We need to change environments. But there are some ways that we could give people tools to make informed choices about the world that we're working with. And for some people, it really pays off to look for employment that's specifically designed for neurodivergent people. There are agencies like Specialist Earn that match people with jobs that are specifically neurodivergent people. There are other pathways. Many neurodivergent people love solopreneurship and thrive in this kind of environment. So in higher education, we could create lunch pads, teach people how to be in those solopreneurship jobs. Business schools can do amazing work here and mentor people to this kind of non-traditional careers, which tend to agree with many neurodivergent people. But then also many people would want to have standard corporate jobs and careers, and we don't want to discourage them, but we want to give them a realistic idea of what the workplace is without trying to break them and tell them you're never going to be authentic for the next 40 years of your career. But we need to provide information of what's expected and how they can be their most authentic while still being able to function in different works environments, and also giving them skills for how to find those organizations and situations that are more inclusive for them. Sometimes people don't know what they like. It's very hard to know what you like. And we know that neurodivergent people are less likely to get internships. So try to create opportunities for jobs, shadowing, exploration, informal mentoring, campus jobs. All of those things are extremely important. Self-advocacy skills, and really just trying to give them examples of different ways in which neurodivergent people of different types of neurodivergence can be successful at work. And if you have staff, faculty, or higher ranking administrators who are willing to disclose, that definitely can be very helpful. And we can also help students by creating career services that are not based on typecasting, because very often we say, okay, so if you're dyslexic, you're going to be either entrepreneur or a creative. If you're autistic, you're going to go in tech. But there is very different type of abilities in each subgroup. So really trying not to pigeonhole people and try to find what each individual student is going to be best at is really the way how we can serve them best. And yes, there are some autistic people who love tech and some ADHD people who want to be entrepreneurial, but not necessarily. It can be completely opposite from those stereotypes. So try to use valid assessments of actual abilities and interests and try to guide people towards careers that are going to be the best fit for them and give them a few options, because very often students think it's just one thing that I can do, and if I'm not going to do this thing, I'm going to die. So I'm always trying to say that there are quite a few things we can do and try to think about it a little bit more flexibly, because again, the world changes all the time and we need to be prepared for unexpected. So trying to mix to weigh the realism with encouragement and giving people as many skills as they will need is really the best that we can do in preparing students for the world of work. And as people in higher education, we can also do research. And sometimes we can do studies that help debunk those myths. We can just teach basic facts about how neurodiversity can be better understood even by psychologists, even by clinical psychologists, because there are quite a few misconceptions even within the psychology profession. And then communication, education, business, HR, all of those students could use information, facts, research about neurodiversity so that they could use it in their future careers. And as much as possible, model an inclusive organization. Can be on the level of the university, but can be on the level of school or department or a specific small group. The more people see how it is possible to work harmoniously with accounting for all of our differences, the more they're able to, take it to their other environments and create better environments everywhere. And we can also sometimes create education for our communities as well and help them understand what the full range of neurodivergence and how we can create societies that are more fair to all of us. And basically, if that's super complicated, one thing that I would boil it down to is treat people how they want to be treated. Because it's very easy to say, well, I have this kind of abilities, and what's good for me is good for everyone else. Very often we need to be reminded that, you know, I'm a reader. I personally started reading, I was at 18 months. Not everyone is like that. Not everyone is going to be happy if I assign huge textbooks and never try to explain things in a somewhat different way. So I would try to also understand that people learn in more than one way. And again, I've been teaching for 30 years, and it's something that you learn, that you need to explain things in different ways, and students are all going to be different. And some of them are very different from who I am. So this is something that I personally try to practice, try to understand who they are, where they are, and meet them where they are. And as far as, again, I already mentioned that if you want to meet me, LinkedIn is usually a very easy way to find me. And check out the Canary Code, check out all the articles. I have quite a few in Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, and there's a lot of it is linked on my LinkedIn. But let me get out of this, and hopefully we can spend some time doing Q&A. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Praslova. That was just amazing. And I'm really blown away by the advocacy and community building that's happening in the Q&A right now is really beautiful. So this is magic right now. I want to start the Q&A by just talking about a theme that I've seen come up. This was something that was raised in even when folks were registering, folks were offering questions, and it's come up in the Q&A today, and that's around disclosure. And so folks are really curious around when in the application process or at some point when you are, employed, when and how should you discuss if you are neurodivergent and how to do so in a way that is effective and sets up a path for education and advocacy. So any thoughts you have on the complexities of disclosure?
Oof, yes, there are many complexities, and it really depends on the purpose of disclosure. And I know I sent my HBR article on disclosure that's more like for chronic illness, but also applies to neurodivergence. It really depends on who you are, where you are in your career. Some people are all for advocacy. They want to disclose as soon as possible, and they will say, if this job doesn't want all of me, I don't want that job. And I congratulate those people. I obviously won't be able to take back now because of all of my social media. So if I were looking for a job now, that's what I would do. But if I were looking for a job, let's say in the beginning of my career, and I was someone who was socially economically vulnerable and needed steady employment. Sometimes people shame those who say, well, you're masking, but sometimes you you need to do what you need to do to survive. And if you are reasonably sure that this job is going to be okay fit, and because you really don't want to be miserable in your job, but you're not ready to disclose, and you don't necessarily need something immediately, it's perfectly fine. People say, oh, if you don't disclose, you're lying and you're not doing the right legal thing, but nobody's required to disclose. And sometimes people don't want to disclose at the first stage. You can also disclose without disclosure. So let's say you get to the interview stage and you could ask questions. Let's say, oh, what are the social norms in your department? Let's say, how do you socialize? And if people say, oh, yeah, we all go to, have drinks every Friday, then you could kind of keep probing. If that's not your thing, then how that's going to work for you. Or let's say the work flexibility. You might also see how much flexibility there is in the schedule. And you can disclose something like, um, I function so much better in the afternoon and in the evening. Other opportunities to work with my schedule. And you can also say, I've noticed in my previous settings that I work a lot better with natural light, or when it's quiet, or whatever it is, or when I can go outside and walk around for 10 minutes and come back, and then I'm the most productive. You can ask those questions. And if people have the general understanding that people are productive in different ways, they might be quite favorable to it, and you're less likely to get yourself into a situation that's going to be completely miserable. So if there are those important items, you might want to just ask those questions and disclose without disclosure, just by saying that I need light, or I need quiet, or I actually like playing some music when I'm working. Is it okay there? So whatever it is that you need, you can do it this way, unless you know that you need very specific accommodations right away, then you would want to come forward. But for most neurodivergent people, or for many neurodivergent people, very often just basic flexibility really takes care of what we need. And sometimes we wait too long, and we run into, let's say, performance problems, and then we don't have a very good relationship with our boss. And then we say, but all of this stuff is because I am whatever. So one thing, never wait to that point. It's much better to disclose without disclosure in the beginning, Or if you're starting to struggle, you can try again, disclosure without disclosure, and can say, can I work from home, 2 days a week because I'm much more productive, and you can look at my output and just give me, 2 weeks, a month, whatever is reasonable, a trial period. And that could save you from burning out, your performance sliding, and ending up getting fired and saying, oh, by the way, I'm autistic, at the point where nobody cares, which unfortunately happens. So that's one thing I would avoid with disclosure, is waiting till the last moment, because then people see it, you're just making excuses. And so be proactive, but don't put yourself unnecessarily in the path of harm. Sometimes it makes sense to get to know who people are, your boss, your coworkers, what kind of culture there is, and then you might be much more comfortable in disclosing. So there are many, many different scenarios. And again, my HBR article on disclosure actually goes through a variety of different scenarios. And each situation is different, again, where you are in life and what your needs are and what is your fit with your institution. I got on job crafting for much of my career. Well, actually, I didn't know I was autistic until my late 40s, so it's not like I had an option. But I really just kind of worked my way through with either just saying, you know what, I really don't do well with noise, for example, because that was true, and I didn't even before I knew I was autistic, I knew that fact. So sometimes I would disclose those things, and you get different reactions. So you do need to know who you're talking to. Sometimes people are going to be accommodating, and I had situations when people would laugh in my face. And unfortunately, you sometimes deal with more and less accepting environments, and we just have to be wise and know who we're dealing with. That's a short version.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I love the way that you sort of talk about that. And it seems like it really would be dependent on the cultural context and on the relationship that you have there. But I love the way that you sort of highlighted just asking questions about cultural fit and about social expectations. Because, just like the canary in the coal mine, those are things that would be useful for anyone to know in a new job and when interviewing for a job. And that just seems like a really prime example of that concept. So I know there are so many really wonderful, rich conversations going on in the Q&A, and I hate to cut us off, but we're really we're right at time right now. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out for right now. But please, everyone, join me in the Q&A for giving a really warm, heartfelt welcome to Dr. Praslova for joining us today. And for getting these conversations sort of out in our community. I really hope that all of you who joined us today will take what you've learned and apply it in your classrooms, apply it in your workplace, apply it teaching your leaders, and helping all of us advocate for one another to make OSU more inclusive. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Praslova, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you for inviting me. Those Q&A are just amazing conversation, as much as I was able to see it. Thank you
Wonderful.
very much.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.